I actually would maybe
I got you.
say that there is a difference for Bauer between cultural cosmopolitanism and naive cosmopolitanism. And maybe I have to go back. I'm looking at the quotes right now, and those two are specifically underlined. And I feel like there will always kind of like in an internationalism be an element of cultural cosmopolitanism in as much as like you take an interest in the other cultures and like your fellow workers who live like elsewhere within our like intertwined global internet economic system, and so on and so forth. Like that's necessary for an element of solidarity, but it has to be in this conscious like dynamic relationship with like your own like national context. Like even the thing about like the naive cosmopolitan, like maybe they like they try and pick up parts of the different cultures. Maybe they dress a certain way because of where they live briefly, or like have different objects that they collect. But it still is in this like very naive sense of almost just like collecting things. Like, I don't
Yeah.
know if you've ever interacted with somebody where all their life experiences just seem like things that they like collected so that they could tell people that they did it in the future. And like,
Got you.
yeah,
I can
like I
see
feel
that.
like there has to be this dynamic relationship between like, yeah, the world that you like developed within and your ability to like take that different perspective and like look at like the other worlds that like other people like developed in. And then like that's the only path to like commonality that is like genuine and not just like superficial.
So, like, whenever I was doing my notes, the definition of cultural cosmopolitanism I came to receive was that Bauer has this idea of transcending national boundaries through the adoption and integration of like various cultural elements that then serves as a kind of unifying force, which promotes the international solidarity and understanding that Trent was talking about. Because on the flip side, well, I guess as an aside, and we may get to this later, but we may just introduce it now. Bauer specifically mentions the integration of like national interest groups into the Austrian Social Democratic Party, or at least his envisioning of it. And then on the flip side of cultural cosmopolitanism, this naive cosmopolitanism, which may lead into one of our bigger discussion points, which is something I sent to both Brandon and Trent. Yeah, about like, well, basically, right? Like my understanding of naive cosmopolitanism is simply, I guess, in the conception of Bauer's. I'll just read like these two lines, which is that workers do not see that they are linked to their class opponents by the bond of the national community of culture. Correspondingly, they see all the more clearly that the workers of the other nations are their comrades in labor, suffering, and struggle. And as a consequence, their view of national differences becomes blurred, and the result is renewal among workers of the old idea of humanity. The prevailing mood that emerges among them is one of naive cosmopolitanism. And whenever I read this, I sent both Brandon and Trent a message basically asking, like, does third worldism have the rational kernel of naive cosmopolitanism?
Hmm.
Because the way that that is phrased and the way that Bauer has just sort of presented it to us, it's the belief that even though you have more relations, cultural relations and otherwise, with people who are literally your neighbors or at least like cross a county from you or something like that, that you are still holding up this relationship to the proletariat of other countries around the globe, even though if you two came into actual contact with ideas and cultures, there would be a lot of things you'd have to figure out, let's say. I think there'd be a lot of antagonisms that would come about. Um, and I think we see that clearly with some of the movements happening right now across the third world. And especially with there being a language gap, one of the biggest things when it comes to culture that Bauer has elucidated throughout this whole text is on the front end, there are people who are going to be selling a message to whoever their listener base of the other countries are, which in the case of certain countries is going to be leftists. But their internal documents reflect another more conservative type of governance style that is not being reflected upon by said international proletariat. Let's just call them the Western proletariat, who are, quote unquote, third worldists, because they can't speak the language. And I can't fault them for that. But I'm just wondering what the relationship is today between this naive cosmopolitanism of proletariats and third worldism.
Well, I think it's kind of interesting because our pastor is what I would call a naive cosmopolitan. He's a mission worker, spent a lot of time in Central America, speaks fluent Spanish, is extremely like a large advocate for immigrant rights where we're at. Even though I wish he'd be more brave in our, from the pulpit. However, I think that like what it is at least like what I would say like naive cosmopolitanism is this understanding that yes we do share a common interest, and for Christians the common interest is salvation and Christian life and taking care of the poor and all those things, but it's also sharing a vocabulary and a sense of identity with an outside object. I don't know, whether it's religious or political. It's something that's like binding us across those borders, and I don't know. That to me is my like fit for the words naive cosmopolitanism in my experience.
I think this is actually we discussed something along these lines, like in earlier chapters, kind of the relationship between Christianity and Marxism in this moment right now, in that the universal man of the church is almost directly in opposition to this concept of like the early national development. And now we're seeing in the 21st century both a like failed Christendom and a failed Marxism in many ways. You can really say in a lot of ways as well. Yeah. To Aurelius' comment, I think you can really easily call something like Imagined Communities or the Nations Are a Social Construct naive cosmopolitanism.
I love how often Imagined Communities is like our whipping boy. Like at some point we're going to have to just, not right away of course, but at some point we're going to have to read this text. Once we have a break and a breather and a palate cleanser and whatever, we can do a different kind of subject for a while. But at some point I think we should take that on.
Yeah,
you gotta
I read
have
it.
a whipping
I think
boy.
it's good.
It's a Marxist tradition.
Yeah, I think it's all right. It's not amazing.
It's funny.
And I think I mentioned it a lot.
Well, I think that like a discussion of things like gender roles and like common life in the sense of like relationships between people is something that the national question is, I guess, the easiest to look at from, because people do like have different relationship styles depending on their culture and their upbringing. And I think it's very interesting because a lot of I've known a few Muslim people in my life, and the experience of women in Muslim countries, or like Muslim cultures, I guess, is very similar to the experience of Muslim women or Christian women in conservative Christian, like especially evangelical communities. And I think that there's an interesting like interface between power and gender that goes unexplored by those communities individually, but is very interesting, like from an outside perspective. So we can talk about like how femininity has its own power in restraint, like by being restrained, it has like a separate like role in a community. It gains a separateness of a sort, and is more powerful because like the backbone of any church is literally every female retiree and every like woman of any age that's willing to engage with those people who are going to be there every single week. So I don't know. I feel like that connection between Marxism and the socialist ideals that we're so shooting for are connected, in that we have to like engage a multi-generational, multi-identity group of people with something that is very unifying and might even be alienating in parts in different ways to those people. I don't know. They're just interesting.
But I'm not trying to jump too far ahead, but there literally is in the last section, of the book is titled "The Tactics of Social Democracy." And so in this last section, Bauer goes to, I'm probably not going to find the quote, and we'll eventually get to the quote over the course of going through all the notes. However, Bauer talks about how the method of a multinational single party being the only path forward, so that trade unions do not have to be constantly wrestling with the national question and divided by this national revisionism. I mean, this is it's going to cause division, small scale divisions in this like national conservatism that we see in nationalisms that arise through like petty bourgeois or counter-revolutionary measures. But that's like a preview for like 30 pages from now.
Well, let's see if we can get how long it takes us to get there.
Well, we're 2 pages in, so
Yeah.
The classic.
So to add like the last point on the third worldism thing, like I would almost say
for now.
well, yeah, I'll probably come back. We got cosmopolitanism and whatnot on the mind. But what do you call it? I think like you could almost put like the real rational kernel of a lot of third worldism is that kind of that like almost like is it Sartre or maybe it's just more existentialism in general, but like the idea that like nobody can be truly free until we're all free. And like I do think that third worldism tends to be pretty good, at least about like understanding that even like the lowest among, like on the, entire world like system that like suffer the most have to be like elevated. And then like that is a necessary step that like can't just like be pushed off into the future. And like I don't know, like I've been rereading like Hegel, Haiti, and Universal History, and I do think like there's absolutely this important like on the path to universalism there has to be like this like appearance of an idea in like in an utterly alien context to that from which like it originally arose, and there has to be like this like with the ideals of the French Revolution, it had to like emerge in this other context that even ended up like going to war with the French at a certain point. And that was a condition under which like the ideals of the French Revolution became like truly universal, is like because of this. And I don't know, I want to like look into like Pan-Africanist stuff more. I'm not like very knowledgeable on that, but like I do think like that's the real rational kernel. But like when that comes to you just taking this like totally self-flagellating position within your own like experience as like a first world worker or whatever, I think that's where it becomes like a problem. Like, no, we have things to do here, even though it is still the case that everything I just said also has to happen. And there can be contradictions between those things too. It's not just like an easy like balance to be struck, like it is a constant problem for like a flourishing like working like class movement. And it's a problem like you want to have actually, because once again, like if you have that problem, it actually means like you're doing something. Like realistically for us, it doesn't really fucking matter what we think about the third world. Like that's just the reality of it.
Yeah, that's just right.
Yeah, and I think Bauer would agree, though, that rational kernel that you're talking about on on page 420, he says, now the politics of the property classes are national conservative politics. The politics of the working class are national evolutionary politics. In Austria, the politics of the property classes are national power politics. The politics of the working class, by contrast, are the politics of national autonomy. In order to get towards that universalism, you do, in fact, have to go through this question of nationalities.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Or to put it in very different terms, which I think the biggest nerds among us might appreciate, is that you have to recognize the universal within the particular, so that you
Let's go.
So that way your particular can in fact not stay particular, but it's recognizing that both aspects of existence are equally present at the same time.
We call this a new localism, almost. To dredge up the ghost of Karl Hess and neighborhood power, a new localism, a new type of localism, where we actually start to look at people's like style of life and like what integrates us, like what keeps us even considering ourselves part of something.
Who's
In
Karl
a
Hess?
locality.
Yeah, I was about to say I don't understand. I
Uh,
appreciate that, but I don't
Barry
think I know who that
Goldwater's
is.
speechwriter, and he was also a
Oh,
big New Left figure. Carl with a K, like Marx. Carl Hess. Neighborhood Power. That's one of the very few theory books I've read almost all of. Um, it was. I just was fat. I was a Goldwater guy actually in my libertarian phase. A big fan of Goldwater, and kind of because of Hess is how I got into the libertarian left. So a little bit of my journey getting here to being a Christian communist psycho, like all my coworkers and family think.
I like this quote from the book as a direct response, which is that the workers were once told that it is not a question of whether or not we were Germans or Czechs, for we are all people. Later, they were instructed that it was a matter of indifference which language they spoke, for we were all exploited and struggling workers. Gradually, one becomes cognizant of the fact that one cannot silence the demands of an interest group by having them disappear into a larger totality, by having their concept
Right.
submerged into a broader concept. You are going to exist, and no matter how much you struggle against it, other people around you are going to be proud of the way in which they exist. They're going to identify with and
Yeah.
find meaning within their identity. So, our message of proletarian solidarity across borders and across cultural distinctions is not or should not be meant to be a replacement for the things about our uniqueness within which we find pride. But it's despite the fact that we find pride and meaning and carrying forward traditions of our cultures. Despite that, we also can and should be in solidarity with the rest of the world, with other people unlike us. Doesn't mean we have to be like them. It means we have to accept and recognize them.
And I do think this, in a lot of ways, I think one could read this book in bad faith and make an argument against something like black nationalism in the United States. When I think what this book is proposing is actually the opposite. In fact, it is the problem of the like supremacists. Not like
Yeah.
in the case of Austria, it is the problem of the Germans who are the German workers who are actively oppressing the Czechs, and then like to bring that to a U.S. context. So I think this is something that like I personally have been wrestling with throughout this entire book is like, what is this critique and what is it actually saying? And overwhelmingly in this chapter, it just becomes clear that these national identities exist. The reason that these national identities can't form into one cohesive party unit is not in fact the fault of sectarian groups within oppressed nationalities like the Czechs. It is because of like the German workers continuing to side with the German bourgeoisie.
When Lenin
My third worldist.
When Lenin goes on and on about the problem of Great Russian chauvinism, but also like at the same time, Lenin not equally, but at the same time, he kind of derides the way in which the Jewish Labor Bund, they want a specific Jewish only formation within the party. Lenin says that's just a different form of the same thing. I do think that we should critique and heavily criticize the way in which identitarianism has taken center stage over the last decade and a half, where people say, of course you would say that, you're a white man. It's like, I think it's important to recognize that there is some legitimacy to that criticism. And also, that legitimacy can be overwrought and it can be used to delegitimize the position that you're trying to advance.
Well, I mean, look at the South African thing right now. Like, I mean, I hate to date the podcast, but like the whole idea of South African like nationalism as like a white and in that culture is built upon a different kind of national experience than the black South Africans of that area. So you're going to have like, I mean, this is one of the things like I question, but also affirm that there is some value in this for an American context because I think that we have an extremely unique history culturally in America because we have become sort of nationalists about our own settled continent over the course of 300 years. I've even heard like certain people be like, well, if Europeans have been here 300 years, how could you say they're not native at this point? And there's like this weird critique of like, how long does someone have to be there before they're a native? What does dispossession mean? Like there are like thorny, bad questions you can ask. I mean, they're not bad questions, but like questions where people will like use them for bad faith purposes. And I think that like we have to have an answer for like, what does like living in an area for an extended generational period mean for a group of people? What does that affirm about the geography and their cultural adaptation to that? And also, like, what do we do when capitalism says that we like move from here to there to find work? And I mean, we have a new context for this very thorny question of locality and culture. And so I think that it is important that we like affirm that this is like important discussion material, but we do live in different circumstances to the period the book has been written in at that point, at least in America, especially.
I feel like, especially going through this book, it's actually become more and more clear how certain aspects can actually be certain aspects of analysis can be used today. Specifically in the South African context, the Boer identity is one that was formed as German-speaking communities wanted to form economically autonomous regions from the English-speaking people who were over them, which is what led to the Boer Wars, which is actually mentioned in Bauer, and how the European workers supported the freedom of the Boers, which actually meant the suppression of the native peoples in South Africa. The question of imperialism is a huge problem that I think Lenin starts to deal with at some point, but this is pre that. However, this national identity and the question of national autonomy and whether that means regionally defined is a question that I think in this chapter I brought up a couple times. On page 422, Bauer says, a social democratic nationalities program must derive its concrete demands from the position of the working class within the society, must integrate the particular national problems in Austria into the great social question. If one attempts this, the inevitable result will be the formulation of the socialist policies of the working class and its actual national policy, for which its constitutional and administrative policies serve as a mere instrument.